Good morning, everyone. I'm Amherst Williams. I'm the Executive Director of the Connecticut League of History Organizations, and I want to welcome you to session 4 of Archives 101. Today, we'll be talking about preservation, storage, and housing of archival collections, guidelines, and solutions with Tara Kennedy. I want to first off, thank the National Historical Publications and Records Commission of the National Archives. They have funded this webinar series, and we're really grateful to their support for bringing all this archival knowledge to the greater public. So thanks to the NHPRC. We have with us today myself, Emily Garfinkel's also here from CLHO. She'll be handling a recording and helping with Q&A. If you have questions as we go, as usual, you guys know the drill, pop them in the chat. If something's really on topic and I want to bring it up to Tara while she's presenting, I may do that, but we'll try and save most of the questions for the end after she's done with her presentation. The recording will be available on our YouTube channel and in the Google Classroom, as will Tara's slides. You may have noticed, for those of you who have access to the Google Classroom, that she also posted a couple of handouts which you can take a look at. They relate to things like, places to buy your archival supplies and things like that. So without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Kathy Carwell-Varda, the Director of Conservation Connection, who's our partner in crime on this particular grant project and series, who is going to introduce our presenter today. Kathy.
Thank you, Amherst. Good morning, everybody. Great to see all of your happy, shiny faces, ready to learn about the great things to do with storing your archival collections. I have known Tara for what feels like forever, so really excited to have her with us today. So let me tell you a little bit about her. Tara is the head of preventative conservation at Yale University Library. She holds an MLIS and a certificate of advanced studies in library and archives conservation from the University of Texas at Austin, an MS in forensic science from the University of New Haven. So if a book is part of a murder, she's all over it. She's all over it. And has a bachelor's degree in art history from Northwestern University. Before coming to Yale, she was an intern at the National Archives and worked at the Smithsonian's National Anthropological Archives and the Gerald R. Ford Conservation Center, the Nebraska State Historical Society in Omaha. She is a professional associate with the American Institute for Conservation. She's an active member of the AIC National Heritage Responders, a group of conservators that specialize in emergency preparedness and response. So if you have any leaks this week because of all the rain, Tara, are you on call this week? You might get Tara.
Someone always is, though.
Someone always is. So she
Yes.
is one of the people who does the 24/7 phone call response. She's a co-chair of the National Heritage Responders Working Group and former chair of the AIC Health and Safety Network. Outside of her preservation work, she's a volunteer for the DOME Network, the Online International Center for Unidentified and Missing Persons. So I am thrilled to introduce all of you to Tara Kennedy. Take it away, Tara.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to share my screen to make sure you all can see the presentation. Can people see things like a slide? Yes. Excellent.
It's great, Tara.
Awesome. Thank you. So like folks said, if you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat as we go along. And as we also said, slides will be available. So don't feel like you have to write furiously of everything that you see on the screen. You will have time to peruse them and also the recording afterwards. So lean back, enjoy, listen, I guess. So just to go over what we're going to go over today, what you'll learn today, best practices for archive storage environment, storage furniture selection, which materials and which features should you be looking for when you're looking for storage furniture, housing for archives, general recommendations and information for sort of overall materials, housing for specific archival collection materials. So we go from architecture drawings all the way to videotapes. So almost A to Z, but not quite. Housing methods, sort of the do's and don'ts for housing collection materials, and some low-cost solutions that I hope will be helpful to you all. So overall, generally, what I'll be giving you is information that I consider best practices. However, it's not about striving for perfection. Every institution and collection is different with its pluses and its minuses. And sometimes you just have to work within the parameters you have instead of trying to achieve storage conditions that may not be possible with existing spaces, HVAC, heating, air conditioning, ventilation and air conditioning systems, budgets, etc. So there are things you obviously want to try to avoid from happening. So reducing risk is probably the biggest thing you should aim for to start, especially when it comes to environmental conditions. So what do I mean by best practice, striving for room temperature without being too damp or dry? So room temperature conditions is, generally most of the time, if it's in a space where you have people and collections, room temperature is good. If you can get it cooler without the humidity being affected, and it's just a storage area, that is helpful. But you want to avoid the real damp air. You want it to avoid it being damp or too dry. High humidity can cause mold, and it can attract pests. And dryness can dry out some materials and make some painted surfaces and photographic emulsions crack. Another thing to do is try to reduce light exposure to your collections. Try to keep collections out of direct light where possible. And so this will reduce the risk of fading and discoloration over time. So turn off lights in storage areas when the room's not in use. If you have displays, you can use surrogates for display. This will go a long way in keeping collections in good shape with legible text for the future. And keeping pollutants and pests from coming into collection spaces. Pollutants also include things like dust and dirt. So having a routine for housekeeping is very important to keeping collections safe. Things like dust and moisture attract pests and encourage mold growth. So simple routine dusting and vacuuming will help a lot in keeping collections safe. Reducing food and drink consumption around collections is also very helpful in keeping pests at bay. And if you do have events involving food or drink, cleaning up and trash removal from the spaces should occur as soon as possible after the event to avoid having any unwanted visitors. So this is a section we'll be talking about storage furniture selection. So when selecting storage furniture, the materials are just as important as the functionality of the furniture. Some materials have byproducts that could harm the very materials you're trying to protect. So try and look for what we call inert or stable materials. And here are the top three you might want to consider here. Powder coated steel shelving, steel cabinetry, that sort of thing. That's usually the storage furniture of choice for conservators. It's a synthetic polymer coating that's fused onto steel, so you don't have to worry about anything off-gassing. So that means there's no gaseous byproducts that are coming from the coating that might harm your collections. So when I talk about gaseous products, off-gassing, that sort of thing, so if you imagine like you've painted a room and you can smell the paint drying, that's what emissions are, basically what you're smelling. And that's when they talk about paints having low VOCs or low emissions. VOC stands for volatile organic compounds, and that's essentially what odors are. So that's what we're trying to avoid having. So if anything has sort of an odor, like, with PVC, like polyvinyl chloride plastics have sort of an odor, anything like that, that usually means it's off-gassing something, and that could be a problem for collections. Anodized aluminum is really great. It's sturdy and it's lightweight. It's usually used for painting or framed hanging racks like you see in the picture here. It can also be used for oversized textile drawers that have like a mesh to hold the large textile. I think the only place I've seen those kinds of drawers was at the Smithsonian, where they have gigantic quilts and things like, or flags, things like that, banners, and they were in these sort of flat file drawers with this mesh underneath, so it sort of like cradles the textile. They're quite nice. And chrome plated steel shelving, this is actually something that's getting more popular. It's often seen in cart form, like you see in the slide here. You might hear these called baker's carts or metro shelves. They can be purchased with or without wheels, but additional barrier materials may need to be added on the shelving because the shelving is slotted. So you don't want items to fall through, like thinner books, for example. But otherwise, it's a really nice option that's not crazy expensive, like the anodized aluminum tends to be. So avoid wood where possible. So wood is generally not a great choice for shelving collections, especially paper-based ones, but it's also the one that's most universally used. So the thing about wood is it can release acidic byproducts like formaldehyde, acetic acid, and that can stain paper just by having paper objects up against it. And as the picture I'm showing on the screen demonstrates. So that was something that had a wooden backing board, and that's actually the back of a piece of paper, even though it looks like a piece of wood. So if you do want to use wood or need to, you want to try to find a wood product that has low emissions. Poplar and basswood both actually are low emission woods. And there's different types of plywoods that actually has a stamp on it that have low emissions. There's actually the American Plywood Association, yes, there is such a thing, creates a standard in the industry. So if you look through plywood selections, there should be a stamp that indicates that it actually emits low amounts of VOCs. But if you do use wood, if you use something like a moisture-borne polyurethane to seal it, that works great as another barrier to keep the wood from off-gassing. But if you do have wood, there's other ways you can utilize it. You can use one of these barrier materials to protect collections. So you can use inert metallic laminate, or the brand name is called Marble Seal, which I'm showing there in the slide. It's an aluminized polyethylene and nylon barrier film, and it resists the transmission of gases and water vapor and is puncture resistant. So that's like really high-end stuff. But you can use something as simple as plain old aluminum foil. It works actually very similarly to Marble Seal. It just doesn't have that same flexibility that a plastic might have. But it actually does the same thing when you wrap stuff to put it in the freezer. It's protecting it from moisture and forming ice crystals, and it blocks vapor, including moisture vapor. Glass works, another great simple material that works as a barrier. And plexiglass also can be used, but plexiglass can absorb and remit pollutants and gases. So once it's been used as a barrier material, you don't want to reuse it for anything else. And if you want to hide your barrier layer, like if you're going to use the aluminum foil, you can always add something else on top, like rag board, archival board on top to hide the barrier layer. So in terms of construction features, you should look for shelving and furniture that has a smooth, non-abrasive finish. You want to avoid furniture with sharp edges and protruding nuts and bolts. And having a furniture with a chip-resistant finish works well as also. And strength of the furniture, of course, is important, especially depending on what you're shelving on it. It should be strong enough to support the collections that you're housing, so you don't want shelving or drawers that bend or warp under the weight of the collections on them. If need be, shelving sometimes might need to be bolted to the floor, wall, or ceiling to prevent the shelving from wobbling. Adjustability is also really important. Shelves that can be adjusted to different heights, meaning they can accommodate a variety of collection types. Lowest shelf, but you want your lowest shelf to be at least 4 to 6 inches off the floor in case of flooding. And if you need a little more protection for some art collection items, I mean, not all archives just have paper, after all, you can get cabinets with doors. Those are also a good option to prevent moisture, to prevent dust and dirt from getting on things. You want to make sure the cabinets are ventilated to some extent. It helps prevent moisture buildup from air being trapped inside. So you don't want to create sort of a micro environment inside your cabinets. And if you do have cabinets with drawers or flat file drawers for oversized paper materials, you should make sure that there are stops on the drawers to keep the drawers from coming out accidentally. Those drawers are super heavy, especially the flat file ones. So you don't want to make sure that they don't accidentally like hurt somebody if you pull them out. If you have ball bearings in your drawers, that means the drawers will open smoothly. And if need be, you can also line your drawers with archival foam as a cushion to prevent shock and jarring on objects if you can't get that smooth openability with the drawers. So for collections that are tight on space, compact shelving, high density storage systems can be a really great investment. So there are some things you do need to consider before deciding to install such a system. First, the one question you have to ask yourself is, can the floor in the storage space handle the weight of the shelving system? So when you find out load flooring, you need to consider not only the tracking for the system, the floor treatment and the shelving have to be considered, but also the collections that will be going into the space. If you think like in the example here, in the image, it's a lot of books, which could weigh quite a bit. So all these things need to be taken into consideration if you are planning on installing high density storage in your facility. And speaking of collections, it's important to know what you have to store and whether or not you are selecting the right type of compact shelving. Is the shelving wide and deep enough to accommodate bound newspapers, for example? How many books and archival boxes are you looking to store in the space? Getting this information up front will ensure that you're buying enough shelving for what you have and for future acquisitions. Your tracking system that runs the opening and closing of the compact shelving should be smooth, non-jostling, so that the objects aren't moved around unnecessarily. So you also want to ensure that the aisles have enough space when open to retrieve things safely. So you want to think about aisle width when you're retrieving those bound newspapers. You should also try to leave a tiny bit of space between the compact shelving to allow for some air circulation when the areas are not in use. And lastly, in case of where there might be an emergency and the shelving becomes not accessible due to damage, etc., you might want to ask the manufacturer if there are any fail safes on the shelving to allow for access. So if something happens to get jarred and it gets jammed, is there a way to override it so that you can manually push it? Because some of these are electronic open and closing. Some of them are manual with like a wheel that you turn. So it sort of depends on what you end up choosing for the storage system. All right, now on to housing for archives. So why is proper housing for archival collections so important? I feel like it's the best quote unquote bang for your buck. In other words, the money spent on good quality housing materials is the best investment you can make for your archival collections. Proper housing, meaning housing that is the right size for the object and made of the right materials, protects the object without causing damage. Good quality, properly fitting housing protects objects from pests and environmental damage. Good quality paper-based housings act as a buffer of sorts from environmental fluctuations, especially in relative humidity. So it protects objects from light damage, it protects it from dust and dirt, and it can also protect objects during a water emergency. Some of the recent water emergencies we've had at the Yale Library, what was very obvious to me is that when there was water that was coming from above that had gotten into one of our storage areas. And the materials that had housings were actually, the housing took most of the hit of the water, really did a great job of protecting collections, as opposed to the ones that didn't have any additional housing on them. So it's an extra bit of insurance. And it also protects materials from damage from handling. So objects that are frequently handled can benefit from a housing that one can see through and examine the object without directly touching the object. And that's especially true for a lot of different photographic materials. Okay, so what kind of materials should you use? So ideally, any paper-based material that comes into contact with a collection item should be acid-free and lignin-free, especially when it comes to paper-based objects like archival collections. Buffered or paper-based materials with an alkaline reserve are also good for most archival collections, except for collections that may be inherently acidic. Those are things like leather and silk. So you can choose materials that are also low lignin, but try to choose those items for housing materials that are not directly touching the object. So for example, a document or manuscript box that houses acid-free, lignin-free folders is fine to have a low lignin box, document box, or manuscript box, because the folder is what is touching the actual objects. And other things to look for are standards that specify that the materials will not cause harm to collection materials. So the photographic activity test, it's widely known as the PAT, is an international standard in itself. It's ISO 18916. The PAT explores the possibility of chemical interactions between photographic materials and a given material after prolonged contact. So reputable vendors will list it in a product specification, like I'm showing here for newspaper folders on Gaylord's website. And in some cases, the product will have embossing right on the material itself with its specifications. It's kind of hard to see in the picture, but it's super helpful to know whether or not the folder that you're looking at, like, is this archival? It actually will tell you here. And I've included a list of vendors for archival materials on the Google Classroom site for you. Okay, so what the heck is lignin, right? Okay, and why is it bad? So what lignin is, it's a component of plants that basically gives structure to plants and trees. And it's got this like tangled, webby kind of chemical structure that readily reacts with any sort of catalyst, especially ultraviolet light. So when it breaks down, it becomes acidic and causes paper to degrade and discolor. So if you think about newspapers that are left out in the sun too long and how quickly they turn yellow, newsprint is a paper that contains a lot of lignin. So this is why conservators emphasize eliminating lignin content of paper-based housing materials, because it is one component that doesn't need to be in the paper that can help tremendously in the longevity of the paper or board used in housing materials. So for plastic-based housing materials, you want to use one of the safe 3 Ps. That's polyester, polypropylene, or polyethylene. So you want to look to see that the package or the description on the website specifies the type of plastic. Another helpful hint is that the manufacturer says that it is past PAT, as seen here for the description from Hollinger Metal Edge's website. And if you can't find either of those pieces of information, try a different source for your plastic-based materials for housing. So why are other plastics a problem? The 3 plastics that I listed in the last slide are inert, meaning they don't have a component that could react with other types of materials, such as metals. So here's an example of what happens when things like coins come into contact with PVC or polyvinyl chloride. US coins have a high amount of copper, and it's reacting to the free chloride in the polyvinyl chloride plastic and creating copper chloride, that green color that you're seeing on the coin. So it's actually there's volatile components, which is the free chloride that's actually being off-gassed by the PVC. Every time you open a new shower curtain liner that's plasticky smell, you're smelling those components that are turning this coin green. And what else should you avoid when looking for housing materials? Watch out for the buzzwords. Acid-free, all that means is that it is a neutral pH at the moment of manufacture, but that doesn't mean it's going to stay that way. There could be components in the paper, plastic, or board that will cause it to become acidic over time. So if you start to look up materials that are quote unquote acid-free that's out there on the market, it actually starts to kind of get funny about how so many things are acid-free, like pens, glues, tapes. and there's no guarantee that anyone tested the pH level of any of these products. So they just say this so that they grab your attention and then you'll buy it. And the term archival also doesn't mean anything in terms of the quality or composition of a product. It simply is added, again, to grab your attention as a consumer. So the bottom line is, if you don't know what it's made of, don't buy it for collections care purposes. That is probably the best advice I can give you all today. So what else should you avoid with housing materials? Like I mentioned, unknown plastic products can contain things that could react with your object, like you saw with the coin and the plastic housing in the previous slide. Wood pulp paper products are filled with lignin. Acidic paper pulp, due to the way it's processed. Acidic sizings, like corrugated cardboard, is a good example of wood pulp paper. Tapes and adhesives should not come into direct contact with your artifact. Even those archival tapes like document repair tape or Filmoplast are not a great idea, since we aren't certain of the long-term effects of the adhesive on the objects. And they also tend to have carriers and adhesives that are often stronger than the paper that can handle, which ends up resulting what we call tenting. So it's as if basically the tape starts to like lift up and becomes pointed slightly, and it looks sort of like it's made a little tent. And that's why we call it tenting. If you need to use paper clips, try to find the plastic ones. They're wider and they are less likely to stab the paper because they don't have those pointy ends. And rubber bands, don't use rubber bands especially if you know your environment's really warm, because treating an object with a stuck rubber band on it, it can fuse paper together and it's next to impossible to get apart. Ask me how I know. And sticky notes and sticky tabs can also be a problem too, as the adhesive on those can become permanent over time, and they will often lift ink off paper or break weak or brittle papers. So if you need to keep a sticky note, consider putting it in its own plastic sleeve, like as you're processing archives, and put it in front of the document that it was on. So at least it's in the same order. And so you can tell that it was associated with the object behind it. And in this example I have, here, I'm going to turn on the pointer that I've circled here. I don't know how well you can see that in the slide. There's a very slight pink residue there on that folder. So the hot pink color somehow transferred onto the folder. It's something I hadn't seen before. So it was something I thought I would share with folks, that sometimes even like just the color or the dyes from the actual sticky note can actually transfer. So something else to watch out for. And that was a new one on me. So let's talk about housings for specific archival collection materials. So for manuscripts and documents, acid-free, lignin-free folders are important. As you saw from the previous slides, having paper-based materials free of acid and lignin means long-term protection for your collections without damage. And that's really the recommended baseline materials for storing historical documents and manuscripts. Materials like manila folders, you probably heard that term before, are made of semi-bleached wood pulps, and they have lignin in them, so those aren't recommended. And fun fact that I learned, you've heard the term manila envelope, I imagine. It was named after the capital city of the Philippines, because manila paper used to be made with a fiber called abaca, which is grown in the Philippines. It's a strong fiber, but nowadays it's made for special paper because of its high cost. Now manila is just a name, and I think maybe people even consider it like the standard color of sort of office folders that you see every day. And buffered or alkaline reserves in folders is an added bonus, but it's not required. And it can help acidic paper from deteriorating further. So for collections that are made of poor paper, an alkaline buffer can extend the life of the paper. Acid-free, lignin-free, or low lignin document boxes are also recommended. As long as you're using acid-free, lignin-free folders, you can do the acid-free low lignin boxes. And Mylar or Melanex L sleeves, polyester, are great for letters and documents that are slightly torn or on thin, more delicate paper. They make handling easier and protect the objects from tearing further. And it's also great for oversized materials like maps, posters, since you can display them with a backing board for rigid support, like a 4-ply mat board, for example. Mylar would be used in addition to a folder, as the collection information is easier to write on folder stock than it is on Mylar. And because of the staticky element of these sleeves, you should not house materials that have media that might like accidentally lift off the paper, such as pastel or charcoal. And of course, you want all of these materials to have passed PAT. So paper-based photographs, meaning photos that are on thinner paper, like more modern black and white photos, color snapshots, and older processes like cyanotypes, should be housed similarly to manuscripts and documents. Polyester L sleeves are useful for frequently handled items or items that may be torn or damaged. And again, acid-free, lignin-free document boxes are also recommended. And manuscript boxes work fine for smaller photos, but flat document boxes are better for larger size photos, so they don't end up misshaping your larger photos. You want to make sure the folder is the same size as the box so that the folders do not shift or slide around the box. For photographs like carte de visite or tin types that have a little more thickness and weight to them, you probably want something more secure that has 3 sides rather than something that acts more like a pocket rather than an L sleeve. Otherwise, all best practices for photographs apply to items like carte de visite, stereopticon photos, and tin types. For cased images, for cased photographs, you want to have your housing have a little. You want it to have a little more protection because because of the glass element. For these, a 4 flat box is shown on the left. That works well to protect the object, especially when you're adding multiple cased images to another box with padding. Small clamshell boxes, sometimes used for microfilm storage. I've seen microfilm stored in these sometimes. With added padding can also work well for cased images, especially ones that happen to be missing missing the lid, the upper part of the casing. You can add padding such as foam or cotton batting to help protect the glass if you want to have that extra protection. And of course, labeling the items as glass or fragile is always helpful, so people know what they're handling as they're taking it off the shelf. So for photographic negatives, for your general photo negatives, either the cut film or the strip film from 35mm cameras, you can use either paper sleeves or envelopes, or polyester propylene sleeves like the ones shown here. And then these can be housed in acid-free, lignin-free boxes. They can also be put inside folders inside acid-free, lignin-free boxes if you want to keep the associated photograph and the associated negative together. Glass plate negatives and lantern slides, if they're in good condition, you can house them in these 4-flap acid-free, lignin-free wrappers, and they'll protect the negative from scratches. And then they can be placed vertically in boxes as seen in the upper image in the slide at the top. Spacers may be needed in the box if it's not full enough. The object of the game is to make sure that the negatives stay vertical and do not shift or tip so they don't end up cracking. And the same is similar with lantern slides because they too are made of glass. For motion picture film, You want to have non-metal cans like these. These are made of polypropylene, the one that you're seeing here. Most cans these days are vented in case of acidic gas buildup from such film types as like cellulose acetate. So if you have film in your collections that smells like vinegar, you definitely want to put it in a vented can because that's cellulose acetate. So what you're smelling is acetic acid, aka vinegar. So if you want to make sure it vents out of the can, because it is the vapor that's coming off of the film can then, if it's trapped inside the case, can then further break down your film. So you want to make sure that that gets vented out so that it's not degrading your film. And if you happen to have access to a film winder, you can put the film on these polypropylene cores. But if you keep them on the reels, that's perfectly fine if you don't have access to a film winder. And because of the weight of most motion picture film, film cans are best stored flat. For audio tapes, videotapes, DVDs, and CDs, you can actually store them in their original boxes or jewel cases, or buy boxes specifically for the item if the box is missing or severely damaged. Often you want to keep the original box and lining because they have important information on them that tells you what's actually on the tape. So most collections end up keeping the original material in terms of the original housing. Cassette tapes and CD cases are often made of a form of translucent polystyrene, and that should be fine as long as you keep it away from light, especially ultraviolet light. And you can place them into an acid-free, lignin-free box. And for all audio and video media, you want to store the items on its side, not flat. So basically any of the shorter edges, so like you see in the images here in the boxes. And you want to keep any magnetic media away from strong magnets because that can accidentally erase the media. CDs and DVDs don't have this issue. It's only tape media because of the magnetic components that are on the tape. So for bound materials, if you have some lightweight books or journals, a 4-flat box with a Velcro coin or twill tie to keep them closed works very well. They're often called, I think, adjustable rare book boxes is often what they're called in some of the Archival supply catalogs. And you can get them in different sizes, and they show you how to measure your materials so you can get a good fit. And for larger items, a clamshell style box of board or corrugated board works very well. You especially want that for things like scrapbooks, or for large heavy books like bound newspapers, that sort of thing. An Archival quality corrugated blue board works very well when they make these boxes to make sure it can take the weight of all the materials, and having it in a box and also ensures that all of the loose pieces that are bound to be in your scrapbook are kept within the scrapbook. This is an extreme example here. This was a very enthusiastic scrapbooker who had a lot to say about their, this was a person who was documenting their experience becoming a Canadian citizen to a US citizen in the early 20th century. And apparently there was a lot of paperwork. So this is why there was a giant, it ended up being a giant scrapbook. But at Yale, we have a box making machine, and we had this box made. But you can also access vendors who have the same box making machine who can create custom boxes for special items or items that are especially unwieldy for you. Newspapers in general suffer from what we call inherent vice, meaning that their very makeup causes them to be not stable and deteriorate over time. As mentioned earlier, at least newspaper made after around 1880 is made of wood pulp, which is filled with components including lignin that causes the paper to break down quickly. So if you want to save newspapers, it's probably important to store them away from light in folders that are acid-free, lignin-free, with a buffered component to keep them from deteriorating as quickly. Those folders can then go into flat, acid-free, lignin-free boxes. Newspaper clippings. 2 big recommendations I do. I tell people they can photocopy the item onto acid-free, lignin-free paper, because you're preserving the content of the paper, what's written there, not necessarily the piece of paper itself. That's going to last a lot longer than the clipping. If you want to keep the clipping, you can place it in a Mylar or Milanex polyester sleeve and put a piece of buffered paper in the back of it. That'll help to slow down the deterioration of the newspaper. For architectural drawings and prints, because they're often challenging due to their size, so rolling architectural drawings is probably the best way to store them when space is limited. So you can either protect the rolled drawings by rolling archival paper or plastic around the roll after you've rolled your item onto it, and tie it and place the roll in a clear plastic bag and tying it closed, or you can place the whole roll in a telescoping box like you see here in the slide. The core is actually the most important step, as it protects the drawings from having smashed edges, and it also protects it from like getting really tightly rolled so they're difficult to unroll. And it's probably the more important part than the actual boxing part. And you can also do this kind of thing with oversized textiles, all assuming these things are in good condition. And if you have flat architectural drawings and prints, oh yes, there it is. You can put them in flat file drawers in oversized folders. So the folders should either be the same size as the drawer, and if you have smaller things, then you should have 2 folders that take up half of the drawer. Having the folders be the same size as the drawer prevents objects from sliding around. Ignore these particular folders. They're not acid-free, lignin-free. I just wanted to show examples of folders that fit the drawers and were fit two into one drawer. And it just illustrated what I meant. So, and finally, with cats, you really can put them in any kind of box, mostly because they will go into and or try to fit into almost any box. So no special box is required for cats. All right, I see. I want to make
Sarah,
sure.
I just want to let you know that you've anticipated a very important question that was coming up, which was the name of your cat. So thank you for dealing with that in slide.
Oh yes, no problem.
Everyone's very excited about that.
The one who was climbing over me was Benjamin. So, but Lucy, that's my other cat, Lucy. Okay, housing methods. So you want to make sure. So all the examples you're seeing are real life examples that may or may not be from the institution and where I work. So make sure your folder or sleeve or envelope covers your entire object. It's especially important when you put fragile items in flip top archival boxes, as items could get damaged from the lid opening and closing. So when ensuring that the folder protects the item overall, you want to also make sure that it's not overfilled with documents, letters, etc. The wider a folder gets, the shorter one size of the scored letter and legal folders get, as you can kind of see in the picture in the lower right. So you want to, and from an ergonomic standpoint, it makes the folder difficult to lift out of the box if the folder is too heavy. Ask me how I know. And if you can't fill a box the whole way, use a spacer to ensure that the folders inside the box do not slump or sag. And this will prevent your papers and documents from getting warped, misshapen, or damaged. You can also use pieces of board that you just score and bend. It doesn't necessarily have to be a spacer that which you can buy spacers, but you can also use like scrap board to actually, that's the same dimensions to hold up to make spacers. So I mentioned the slight static charge that Mylar polyester sleeves have, and that static can help to keep loose pieces in place. I use them all the time in my work when I need to piece together torn documents that need to be prepped for digitization orders at the library. So that's what I've done here in the before and after piece. If the paper is very thin or delicate, I find that Mylar or Melanex folders actually work better than the L sleeve. So if you have something that's particularly or a lot of pieces, then it's better to have the folder because you can open it the entire way, set all the pieces down, and then lower the folder. It's a lot easier than the L sleeve. And as mentioned with the flat file drawers, it is important to have the folders be the same size as the storage box, not the size of the object being stored. So that way the folders don't slide around. So in this example, you can see that the box on the left has various sizes of folders, making it challenging to even find what you need as they've kind of slid all over the box. So once all the folders have been replaced with folders that fit inside the box, it's tidy, it's organized, they're labeled. So finding the folder you need is a lot easier. So I just want to mention this product called microchamber paper. They make paper and board. It's an extra element of protection for collection items. It has what's called zeolites in it. And these molecules are made to trap smaller molecules like volatile, low molecular weight off-gassing products such as acidic vapor from film, like with your cellulose acetate. Airborne pollutants are also something that zeolites trap, such as like nitrogen dioxide, ozone, sulfur dioxide, anything that might be considered a gas or a gaseous pollutant. It's especially helpful for collections that have photographs or other type of silver components. It will help reduce oxidation and tarnishing. And if you have something that happens to have like a musty, moldy odor, but you don't have any mold, if you put it in this kind of product, the odor will dissipate over time. I can show you science to show how this works. Laboratory desiccant jars that have paper in it, microchambers on the left, buffered paper is on the right. They added nitrogen dioxide into each of these desiccant jars. After 1 hour, a whole cloud of nitrogen dioxide smog has formed on the side with just the buffered conservation paper, while the jar at the left, the microchamber paper, has completely neutralized the pollutant. And after the test, the pH of the buffered paper fell to 2.4, very acidic, while the microchamber sample retained its neutral pH. That's an extreme example, but it's a great illustration of how well the material works. So it's something to consider for collections, especially really important, sensitive items that you might want to consider. So some low-cost solutions. So one thing to note in our current economy of inflation and post-pandemic universe, or pseudo post-pandemic universe, it really isn't over, but supply chain issues and difficulty getting raw materials, prices of things like archival board and paper have increased. There have also been delays in getting items, so some patience may be necessary when ordering archival products. So as the Miracles and the Captain and Tennille have told you, you got to shop around in terms of finding the best price. I provided a list of multiple vendors that sell similar products. So it's about which vendor can give you the best price for the product you want. They do have to compete with one another, so you do have an advantage there. And budgeting purchases into discrete projects by planning for exactly what you need is also a really good strategy. It's also helpful if you're planning for a grant project, knowing exactly what you want to house, what you want to buy to house the objects, with all the costs lined up, grant proposals, grant reviewers really like that sort of thing. Barrier materials can be used for retrofitting shelving that happens to be made of wood. It also works well to use barrier materials for like reusing like tubes for rolling architectural drawings and maps. If you place a barrier layer like the aluminum foil that is archival between your object and the housing material, you can come up with some creative ways to reuse and recycle materials. It's sort of, again, avoiding having the acidic component touch the collection object. And you might see what others may not need anymore or selling online. I've been seeing a lot of that happening, at least in terms of people like closing their like conservation studios, if they're retiring, things like that. So they may have be selling things at a discount compared to what you might be getting in terms of a cost directly from a vendor. All right. In summary, best practices means the best that you can do. It does not mean achieving things that you can't achieve with what you have. Do the best you can. Be a savvy consumer. Read specifications, ask questions, shop around. Housing is your best collection investment overall. Proper housing techniques help protect collections. Acid-free, lignin-free, polyester propylene, polyethylene, they are all an archivist's friend. That kind of rhymed. That was weird. So thank you so much. I know we don't have a lot of time for questions, so I'm also happy to find, maybe I can go into Google Classroom and answer questions too. I just want to make sure that I am able to answer any questions you all have. So
Sure,
thank you
great.
so much.
Thank you so much, Tara. It was incredibly informative and helpful, and also in good humor, I think, too, which everyone has appreciated. So I have a list of questions that have come up, some of which we've tried to address a little bit in the chat, but I'd like to bring some of those to you live as well.
Sure.
Our first question was from Christine, and I think you kind of just answered this right now, but I wondered if you could just kind of like say it explicitly. So she was talking about, what do you do if the shelving in your library is wood, over 120 years old? Should something be added between the books and the shelves? What's the like easiest solution other than replacing those shelves with something else? If you want to work with the wooden shelves you've got, what do you do?
So if you've got old wooden shelves, you're probably not going to have to worry so much about the off-gassing. That's the one thing. Thank you. That's the one thing I forgot to mention. If you have old wood furniture, it's not something you're going to necessarily worry about with off-gassing. So I wouldn't worry about those. I wouldn't worry about your 120-year-old shelving. I think you're probably okay.
And if people have other more modern wood shelving, is, you know, like a barrier material is probably like the quickest solution there.
That
like,
probably is, or I mean, you can also, depending on the material that's sitting on there, you can also house the actual objects. If you have things like archival boxes sitting there, I wouldn't worry about that because your original object isn't actually touching the wood. Again, it's about, if you just think about, is your object directly in contact with the wood? No, then you're probably okay. Or if it's minimal contact, you're probably okay. It's not a wooden backing for like that print like I showed you. Like that's an extreme example.
Great. You've already gone over the question of, should you use manila folders that you get from Staples? No.
No.
You told us the name of your cat, so that was like way up.
That was Benjamin who jumped over me,
Yeah.
and Lucy was in the pit. Lucy got her moment of fame there.
Great. Kathy kind of addressed this offline in the chat, but there was a question about, you had talked about Mylar and how it can lift things like pastel and chalk off because of the static charge. What you recommend for that? Kathy had said in the chat, just an acid, you know, an archival acid-free, lignin-free folder with a paper barrier material. Is there anything else you would add to that?
A lot of people use glassine, but the problem with glassine is, yeah, I know Kathy's making the head, like the same head bob I would make. Because it's like,
the head bob.
Well, it's like, because it's, I mean, they'll have acid-free glassine, but I'm pretty certain I have not seen acid-free lignin-free glassine that I can think of off the top of my head. And that's one of the things. It's like, because it's a very thin, like not a lot of strength, may not be able to, it would be maybe difficult to get the lignin out of it to make in terms of its process. That's what I'm not certain of. I think that paper would be sufficient, honestly.
What about, we had a specific question about vinyl record albums. I think you had talked a bit about, yeah, okay, great.
I collect them. Here, my collection's right over here.
Great, yes. Upright, not packed too tightly, but what about the sleeves? Obviously, if you have a record collection, whether it's your personal one or, you know, one at your institution, you know, there's all of the material which you would want to hang on to, you know, the sleeves with printed materials, the LP albums, like the cardboard album cover itself. What are the best practices for housing those items?
So I happen to collect 45s. So for what I end up using, I have acid-free, lignin-free paper. If they are things without picture sleeves, if they have picture sleeves, you're technically supposed to store the record outside of the picture sleeve because of the fact that the record can kind of cut the sleeve. And then I have that in a polyethylene bag, essentially. They make them for different size record albums, so you can do that. That's LPs. So there's a lot of different kinds of groove media out there. There's I just blanked. Like there's shellac, there's acetate records, there's cylinders, things like that. And I think in the bibliography or the general resource guide I gave you guys that there's some stuff in there too that will help with some of those questions. But generally, that's vertically in boxes. The polyethylene sleeves work very well for that, for records.
Great. When we were talking about motion picture film and vinegar syndrome, basically the acetic acid off gassing, there's a question about I think this is sort of a question about, okay, if you have that problem, okay, say you've housed it in something vented, then you're potentially venting those gases into your collection space. How might that affect other collections in the area? And how should you think about maybe creating some kind of envelope around those or segregating them?
So that's a really good question. So it depends on a couple things. It's going to depend on the room in which the materials are stored in. How good is your heating, ventilating, air conditioning system? If you have a lot of really good ventilation, you're not going to have to worry about a couple films venting the acetic acid out into the space. If you have a very large collection of cellulose acetate motion picture film, that might be something where you require special storage. I might recommend the microchamber storage element if you have a couple in a small, not great ventilated storage space. This may be where you invest the microchamber products, because that's actually going to absorb it and not re-emit it into the collection. But if you have a large collection, this may require like a specialized vault, things that you want to have where the temperature can be cooler and drier. So that slows down the process of the off-gassing. So there's like a cup that sort of depends upon your systems, your space, your collection. Great. So again, I think I'm pretty certain that the resources I included also would probably talk about some of this as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Tova had a question about, a lot of your images had the kind of metal edged reinforced archival boxes. How do those compare with boxes with no metal on the corners?
It's a form of reinforcement for the corners. That's kind of it.
So like it's just it's more durable over time?
Yeah, it's more about durability more than anything else. So because that's the part that gets bumped a lot and things like that. So they end up getting smushed. So it just it's a level of protection to make sure that your corners don't get dented in and hurt your object. So it's an extra level of protection.
And as long as you're mentioning protection, I did want to mention one thing that I learned a number of years ago. There was a water event here in Connecticut, and when we went out to respond, they had both the gloss, what is that called, Tara?
Oh yeah, they have there's the ones that have the water resistant.
There's the water resistant document boxes and acid-free boxes, and ones that don't.
Yes.
And the items that did not have that coating, water went right through. The ones with the coating, far less drying that we ended up having to do. Sweet. I had never realized, and water,
a real life version
water, yeah, I could really see water pooling on the lids of the ones with that coating. So if you happen to have a storage room that has water pipes, or it's in an attic, or it's somewhere where there's high humidity, chance that this is an area that could possibly leak, get the coated boxes. It's absolutely worth it. And you can call Debbie Rossi at the Shelton Historical Society and ask her, did that really happen? And she will tell you, oh my God, did that happen?
Awesome.
Well, that's great. I mean, and I hope this is like welcome information to be, because I know I've been out in the field. I know, like, you're not always storing stuff in the greatest room, right? You're in a historic house. You're putting it where you can. And I think it's really reassuring to know that by housing things well, I think this was sort of on your last slide, Tara. If you house things well, you can mitigate some of the risks to your collection by
Correct.
making that investment, even if you can't install HVAC or, like build a purpose-built storage area or something like
Yes.
that. So that's
That's
really
why I
good.
always tell people like housing of the materials, like that's the way to go.
And
There's been
just
a
to
lot
kind
of questions. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah,
Kathy.
just to put it out there, since we're talking about, the Tara mentioned at the end, the cost. Do not be afraid to ask people when they're donating material
Yes, I saw you put that in
that,
there.
can you also, it's going to cost us a lot of money to house it. If you could donate towards its housing, we will get this process and available much quicker than if we have to, wait until we have money in our budget. Ask, ask, ask. All they can say is no.
That's
Thank
great.
you for adding that, because that is a huge thing that people are really shy about, and it's incredibly important to do that. Thank you for mentioning that, Kathy. Thank you.
Well, it's a
That's
wonderful way to
girlfriend.
ensure that that donation actually gets properly taken care of, right?
Right, exactly.
Which presumably a donor would want.
I would think, why did they give it to you otherwise?
And it's, again, one of those moments for educating people about the work that the Historical Society or the museum or archive does, and the maintenance that's required to keep collections accessible to the public. There was a question about scrapbooks in particular. So should you put barrier materials between the pages of a scrapbook before boxing them potentially? What, like, scrapbooks are tough, right?
Oh,
And
they are.
on all of our, we often get questions about scrapbooks.
Sure.
Do you I know you showed like the bulging, we've all heard these in the archives. What are some good ways of dealing with scrapbooks and protecting the materials? Sometimes you're dealing with newspaper clippings, the backing paper is not always really awesome.
There's so many different levels of ephemerality to those that makes it, meaning like it's materials that were never meant to last beyond like it's like expected use, right? So that's really where do the best you can. If you have a scrapbook that's intact and like the binding still intact and everything, adding something like layers in between will only expand and stress the binding. So I probably wouldn't do that unless it was very select things that you felt like there's like a ton of newspaper in it. Maybe you want to do select ones. Really, I feel like the best thing that you can do with scrapbooks is containerize, is get a box for the whole thing and not worry about interleaving or sleeving. If you have things that have fallen out, then maybe you can put like paper folders that go in between to where the things were if you knew, or if you don't know where they went, adding folders to the box and putting items in the folders. You can even write the page number on them. There's a variety of things you can do, but really I think containerizing is the most important because of their tendencies of things to fall out and get lost.
Great, thank you. I think Kristen has a question that's probably on many people's minds. So aside from unknown plastic products, are the big plastic bins that are easy to find acceptable for storage? We're thinking here maybe plastic filing boxes. She's coming from an institution where they have a very informal space for storage and are really wondering if they can work with anything that they already have.
So things like, I'm thinking like Rubbermaid containers, those sorts of things. So a lot of those are actually made of polypropylene. So if you like flip the container over or see where the manufacturer tells you what they're made of, if it's made of polypropylene, it should be okay. So if you want to do that, that's certainly going to be better than a corrugated cardboard box or a wooden box, anything with metal that may be rusted, things like that. So yeah, I mean, that I think would be fine for like archival storage. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would think that the thing you'd be concerned about there probably more is shifting within the box, because the box is presumably not designed for storing documents or archival materials in the ways that some of
sometimes
the
make those.
purpose-built stuff.
I've seen them where they can put hanging folders in and things like that. So what you can do even with the hanging folders that are not going to be acid-free, lignin-free, if you have acid-free, lignin-free folders within the hanging folders, again, your object is not touching the acidic components. and it's in a solid container that's not made of anything that's going to off gas or get sticky over time. Yeah, I think that those things work. I mean, that's the thing. It's like, if you know what you're looking for and are able to do enough research and ask enough questions, you may be able to use materials or containers that you wouldn't necessarily find on an archival site. So it's just about doing the homework.
That's great. You had talked, Kara had a question, a follow up on, you were talking about the Mylar sleeves. So, you know, the sheet music example that you had, where you kind of piece together a document, put it in a Mylar sleeve for digitization. Can you do that for basically permanent storage of those materials, or is it just a temporary thing for something like digitization?
That one I left as is, yeah, because they're perfectly safe to be housed in those collections. So housed in those items, housed in that sleeve, yeah. I did that for the next person who happens to want to see the real thing. So like, maybe they want to see like, oh, wow, all the pieces. And yeah, so then it's, yeah, I mean, that's because even digitization isn't necessarily going to be the last time anyone's going to handle that thing.
Yeah. Tova had a question about the microchamber paper you were talking about. So does that, like, does it get filled up and then you have to replace it after a while? Okay.
You do.
What's the sort of duration average? I know it totally dependent on the environment, right?
Exactly. It's dependent on the environment. It's dependent upon the temperature and relative humidity of your space, the severity of the problem with your object in terms of off-gassing. So I guess what I would say is, if you notice that like the housing has dissipated the odor, but then you start to smell the odor coming back, that might be a good time to replace it. The other thing, Conservation Resources who's one of the vendors on the list, was originally the main seller of microchamber stuff. And I have been noticing that other manufacturers seem to be making it now. So I've sort of or maybe distributing it. But I don't know, that that's new for me. But if you talk to Conservation Resources, they may be able to give you a better sense of timelines. Oh, thank you for coming, Connecticut Society of Genealogists. I'm sorry. I know I'm sorry. I was concerned that this was too long, and it was. Sorry.
No, we have a lot of people sticking around for questions. I'm going to keep asking these if you're okay to stay for.
I'm fine to stay. Yeah, absolutely. Because yes, absolutely, that's totally fine.
So Ingrid asks, do you use any drying agents in storage boxes?
Like silica gel, things like that. So you can do things like that. So things like silica gel, Artsorb, these are components you can purchase on archival vendors' websites. So what you use those for is to kind of, it's like, you've seen the silica gel packets in some of the stuff you buy, like that's essentially it. So you can use those to create microenvironments. So if you have something that's particularly sensitive to high humidity, for example, you could create a sealed package with Marvel Seal, put the thing in there with silica gel that's been set to a certain relative humidity, so it maintains that. Like if you want it to be 40% all the time, and you would pop it into that Marvel Seal packet and seal it, then that object would be at 40% RH no matter what. But you have to have the gel conditioned to the relative humidity level you want, which is usually how you can purchase it. Trouble is, if you don't put it in a really sealed environment, like the Marvel Seal packaging I'm talking about, then you have to recondition the gel. And that can be, you can use it in an oven, like they have instructions on doing it, but it's not exactly what you'd say. It's not user friendly. It's something that you kind of have to do like repeatedly. So it really would depend upon what you're considering for, like what you're considering it for. If it's something that you're going to access a lot, or something that you need to keep, then that may not be such a great option. But if it's something that you want to put in dark storage, deep storage, then it might be something worth doing. You can also use some of these things for film storage. Molecular sieves or sieves, I don't know how to pronounce that exactly, are also similar to that. So some people do things like that. I know that a lot of the film archivists do that.
Yeah, film and like the audiovisual media is like a whole We could do a whole nother presentation at
Oh,
least. on that,
we
I'm
could.
sure.
There's no question. And digital too. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of stuff I forgot, like records and digital media. Yeah.
So you had mentioned museum and archive listservs where you can often find, stuff on the cheap. Do you have any recommendations on how to locate those?
So there's one that's the conservation community on American Institute for Conservation. I can't remember the name of the actual, let me look.
Maybe that's some follow-up resources we could post to the Google Classroom.
Yeah, that might be, because I don't remember. There's like, you have to sign up to join the group. It's a little, I wonder if the museum listserv, there's like Museum L that used to exist, or the Book Arts website. Like, do you remember these things, Kathy?
Yeah, there's the Connecting to Collections Care Digest.
Oh, of course, that. Yes.
And that's every day there. Anyone can post questions, and there's the monitor changes regularly, but you can post any question. If you say, I found a Revolutionary War cannonball, is it dangerous? You can put honestly, you can put that up. If something's crawling out of the ear of a doll, what is it? These are it can be very practical, very common things, and then there can be things that are out of left field that you start reading because like, that happens,
Yeah.
But you can join that through AIC, the American Institute for Conservation, and it's a daily morning email that comes in, and anybody can post to it. Today was mercury glass and plaster molds, rare books, brass cleaning. So it's soup to nuts.
It runs the gamut. Yeah.
That's great. Adrian says, I'm just going to try and get to a few of these more questions before we break.
I'm going to do the mummy hand while you keep talking archive.
That's fine. Adrian says at the Barnum we've used Coroplast to line some of the shelves on our Metro cards.
Yes.
Is that okay?
Totally fine.
Thumbs up. Okay, great. Okay, Marianne asks, what is recommended for a beaded buckskin shirt circa 120 years old?
Oh, I answered that since it's
not. Oh, did you?
archive.
Okay, I'm sorry.
She's a textile lady. Ask Kathy.
Yeah.
Yeah. I answered that already. It's in the chat. So
right. Okay, sorry. I'm just getting to where I left up. What do you do when you get scrapbooks with 3-ring binder page protectors? Do you need to worry about that plastic?
Possibly. Hey, Benjamin, my cat's back. I think it would depend on the plastic. If you can tell what the sleeves are, sometimes it says what kind of plastic it is. If it's a rigid kind of plastic, those are probably ones that would need to be replaced if you can, because that's the other thing, because sometimes it may be difficult to get the things out depending on what that ends up looking like. Or is it a piece of paper that's got stuff stuck to it that's in a sleeve, or is it just things in a sleeve? It sort of depends. Yeah, it's one of these things that if I saw it, I would know. But if it's a rigid plastic, that's something that is probably most likely not archival. But if it's a more flexible plastic, reminiscent of maybe like a Ziploc bag plastic, it's probably okay. Yeah, it's hard to say without seeing it. Because I have to sometimes look for stamps and things and look them up. If there's any writing on it, on the sleeve itself, try Googling some of the information to see if you can find information on what it's made of, because that's usually what I do.
I think, we're going to leave. Kathy is working on the mummy hand, but mummy is done. Archival experience. But this just goes back to our first question about wood shelves. What about painted wood shelves? Would you want a protective barrier there because of the paint?
Depending on the paint that was used.
And if you have no idea what kind of paint.
If you have no idea and you're worried about it getting sticky, it can't hurt to put an extra layer of something there just to make sure nothing gets stuck. That would be, yeah, if you don't know, it's better to have something that will be provided additional insurance.
Tara, have you ever used Tyvek as a barrier?
It would be a very expensive barrier, but yeah, we do use it.
Okay, because I was just thinking that Used to be, well, you can get it at Home Depot, you just in places like that, but you don't
Oh,
want
you
to use
can?
the printed
No,
parts of the Tyvek because that ink
right.
rubs right off. But
Yeah, 'cause nothing sticks to that stuff.
nothing
It's-
sticks to that. And I will give an example where I used Tyvek. We knew mice were getting into a building
Oh,
and we took out the drawers, it was a general store, and lined the back of the wall with Tyvek,
oh yeah, that'll work.
just stapled it in. No critters, and damn, did the room heat up too because it wasn't so drafty having the vapor barrier in
Vapor
there.
barrier.
So.
It's a
Yeah.
vapor barrier. I was gonna say that's a vapor. Like you've also created a vapor barrier for the house.
Yeah,
So you're
I
probably improved
insulated.
environmental conditions. Well
Yeah,
done.
but you can buy unprinted Tyvek from the acid-free companies.
Oh yeah.
Or in a bind, I've bought the regular and just cut around Tyvek. You know, so.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you can totally use that. That is an inert material.
Well, clearly we need to do like a sort of like conservation, like MacGyver program where like people, go and show and tell
What
like
about
the really
this? What
great
about
like,
that? Yes.
solutions that they've done. Yeah, I think we'll post some of these additional resources, especially around the listservs and stuff in the Google Classroom. I know Emily is capturing the chat so we can capture some of the answers that have gone in there. Tara, I want to thank you so much for your time today. This has been a really great presentation, and clearly the questions have, people have really responded to it. So
That's
I want to thank you
great.
again. Thank Kathy, thank Emily for their support and assistance here. Thanks to you all for being here. Thanks to the NHPRC for funding this program. I want to remind everyone on this call also about the upcoming deadline for Connecticut Humanities, Connecticut Cultural Fund operating support grants. This is, general operating support. Your institution will get at least $5,000. If you don't know about these grants, if you're a museum or historical society, you are eligible. So please visit the Connecticut Humanities website and look under grants for Connecticut Cultural Fund operating support, and make sure that your institution is getting in for that this time around. The deadline is next Friday, but it's a very easy application, very streamlined. So.
And don't forget that the recordings, the slides, and the evaluations. Don't forget this week's evaluations, Brian's from last week. And we can keep the chat going in Google Classroom. So go ahead and enter your questions there as well. We'll keep chatting away about the fun of storing archives.
And cats, of course.
And cats.
So. Thank you
Don't
all.
lock
Have a
your
wonderful
cats in an archive.
have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks again, Tara.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you,
See you guys
Tara.
next week.